I'll never forget that day. It was the most exhilarating moment of my life. It started as an ordinary, quiet day, the kind where nothing noteworthy happens, where you can simply lose yourself in the daily grind without much thought. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across my apartment as I lounged on the couch, flipping through mindless TV channels. But, as always, life throws a curveball when you least expect it. A strange gurgling sound from the bathroom, followed by a loud splash, jolted me upright. My stomach tightened as I realized what was happening. The pipes were acting up again. I knew better than to ignore it. My previous attempt at a DIY fix, guided by a quick YouTube tutorial, had resulted in an even bigger mess. With a sigh, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, locating the number of the local plumber. I'd used him once before. We hadn't spoken much, but I remembered him as efficient and professional. Still, having someone in my personal space always made me slightly uneasy. About an hour later, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find him standing there, toolbox in hand, just as ruggedly handsome as I remembered. He was in his early 30s, perhaps a few years older than me, with a thick beard, sharp features, and arms that strained against his work shirt. His muscular physique suggested he was more than capable of handling any plumbing issue. "Hey, I'm here for the busted pipe," he said, flashing a polite smile as he stepped inside. "Yeah, it's in the bathroom," I replied, gesturing for him to follow. He wasted no time, heading straight for the bathroom to assess the damage. I watched from the doorway as he crouched down, inspecting the mess under the sink. His movements were efficient, practiced, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I should have been feeling grateful, but my thoughts drifted. Something about the way his shirt clung to his back as he worked, the way his muscles flexed with each movement, made it hard to concentrate. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it. "He's just the plumber," I told myself, feeling ridiculous for even entertaining such thoughts. But there was an undeniable magnetism in his quiet confidence, the way he carried himself, that made my heart beat faster. After a few minutes, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he said, turning to face me. "Replaced the pipe, tightened everything up. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual despite my racing pulse. "I appreciate it." His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I could have sworn there was something unspoken in his gaze. He cleared his throat and glanced around the small bathroom, as if searching for something else to say. "You sure there's nothing else you need help with?" he asked, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent that sent a shiver down my spine. For a second I was speechless. Was it my imagination, or was there something more behind his question? My heart raced as I searched for a response. The longer the silence stretched, the more I realized I didn't want him to leave. "Well, actually," I started, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "There might be something else." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze locking onto mine as he took a step closer. "Oh? What's that?" I swallowed hard, my nerves getting the better of me. "It's hard to explain," I stammered, my cheeks burning under his steady gaze. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile as he closed the gap between us. "You can try." I stood frozen, the air thick with tension. I could feel the heat radiating from him, my mind racing. There was no denying the pull I felt, the way my heart hammered in my chest as he watched me, waiting. And then, before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "I've been thinking about you," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Ever since you walked in, I haven't been able to stop." His smile deepened, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small bathroom. My breath hitched as I realized how close we were, how easily I could reach out and touch him. "Is that right?" he murmured, his voice low and rough. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. I couldn't explain it. Couldn't tell him how his mere presence had stirred something unexpected within me. All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I didn't want to. For a heartbeat, we stood motionless, the air thick with unspoken tension, the heat between us building like a storm. Then, just as I thought the moment might pass, He reached out and gently cupped my face in his hand. His touch was warm, firm, yet gentle, and a shiver ran down my spine as his thumb brushed lightly against my cheek. I didn't know what to do, whether to pull away or lean into his touch. Before I could make up my mind, he closed the gap between us, his lips pressing against mine. The kiss began softly, tentatively, as if we were both exploring uncharted territory. But the moment our lips connected, any hesitation vanished, replaced by a powerful, undeniable yearning. His hands wandered over my body, drawing me closer as the kiss deepened. A wave of heat surged through me, unlike anything I'd ever felt. Each touch, each kiss ignited sparks throughout my being, leaving me craving more. It was as if the outside world had faded away, leaving only the two of us immersed in the intensity of the moment. The passion between us escalated with each passing second. His hands, calloused from years of labor, moved over me with a surprising tenderness that stole my breath. The firm pressure of his lips against mine sent another rush of heat through my veins. The drip of water from the recently mended pipe was the only sound that anchored me to reality, a reminder of our location and what was happening. But even that seemed distant as we lost ourselves in the heat of the moment. I pulled him closer, my fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, feeling the solid muscles of his chest beneath. He responded with a low groan, his hands tightening around my waist as if he couldn't bear to release me. The kiss deepened, and for a brief instant, I forgot everything else, the world outside, the lines we were crossing. But just as swiftly as it began, reality crashed back down. He broke away first, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes searching mine as if trying to comprehend what had just transpired. I stood there, heart pounding, mind reeling from the realization of our actions. I started, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? That I hadn't anticipated this? That I didn't understand what had come over me? His gaze softened, the earlier intensity replaced by something more uncertain, more vulnerable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, his hand still resting gently on my waist. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just surprised, I guess." He chuckled softly, the sound easing some of the tension in the air. "You and me both." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from each other's bodies, yet both unsure of what to do next. I could sense the weight of the unspoken question hanging between us. What now? Taking a deep breath, I tried to gather my thoughts. "I didn't expect this," I admitted, my voice shaky. "But I don't regret it." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite decipher. Relief, perhaps, or understanding. He stepped back slightly, giving me some space but keeping his hand on my arm. "Neither do I." The simplicity of his words struck me. It wasn't some grand confession or a declaration of eternal love. It was just honesty, pure and simple. And somehow, that made it even more real. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the small bathroom as if searching for his next move. "I should probably finish up and head out," he said, though there was hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to leave. I nodded, but the thought of him leaving made something in my chest tighten. I didn't want this to end yet. Didn't want him to walk out the door and leave me alone with the memory of what had just happened. But I also didn't know how to ask him to stay. Didn't know if it was even fair to ask that of him. "You don't have to rush," I said, my voice a little too casual. "I mean, if you're not busy." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a small smile. "Are you asking me to stick around?" I felt a blush creep up my neck. "I just thought we could hang out for a bit. Maybe grab a drink or something." He chuckled again, this time a little louder. "You're pretty smooth, you know that?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool even though my heart was racing. Just trying to be a good host. He grinned, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, in that case, I guess I can stick around for a bit." We left the bathroom, the tension between us easing slightly as we stepped back into the living room. I grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, handing him one as we sat down on the couch. For a moment, everything felt almost normal, like we were just two people hanging out, enjoying a quiet afternoon. But there was no denying the undercurrent of tension that still lingered, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just transpired between us. He took a long sip of his beer, leaning back against the couch as he glanced around the apartment. "Nice place," he said, his voice casual. "Thanks," I replied, though my mind was still spinning. "It's small, but it works." We made small talk for a while, chatting about nothing in particular. Work, the weather, the usual things people talk about when they're trying to avoid saying what they're really thinking. But the more we talked, the more comfortable I felt. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by an easy rapport that surprised me. It was like we'd known each other longer than just a couple of encounters, like there was something natural about the way we connected. And yet, beneath the surface, there was still that simmering heat. Every time our eyes met, every time our fingers brushed against each other, I felt it. The pull, the desire that hadn't faded. "Ever think about what just happened?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. He turned, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, been thinking about it a lot." I couldn't tell if I should feel relieved or apprehensive. He set his beer down, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. I think we both know there's something between us." Hearing him voice it aloud made it feel more real, more tangible. I nodded slowly, unable to trust myself to speak. "Not saying I know what this is," he continued, his voice steady but cautious. "But I know I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Neither do I." He smiled, the tension between us shifting into something more certain, more grounded. "So, where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't have an answer. I didn't have all the answers. Barely any, really. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want this to end. Not yet. "I guess we figure it out," I said softly, but with conviction. He nodded, leaning back against the couch, his gaze fixed on mine. "I'm good with that." The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant. In that moment, it was just the two of us in the quiet of my apartment, the unspoken promise of something more hanging in the air. As evening deepened, the warm light from the setting sun softened everything, quieted everything. The world outside seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of us. We sat in silence for a while, comfortable in the quiet, but the weight of what had passed between us was undeniable. Eventually, the unspoken thoughts began to surface. Luke, the plumber, as I'd learned in our earlier conversation, shifted on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. The light touch sent a spark through me, a reminder of the tension simmering beneath the surface. He glanced at me, his expression soft but serious, as if carefully choosing his words. "I don't usually do this," he said quietly. "You know, get involved with clients." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't think you did." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Not saying I regret it, because I don't, but I just wasn't expecting this." "Neither was I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I'm not sorry it happened." Luke's expression softened, and he gave me a small smile. "Me either." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, heavier, more loaded. I could feel the pull between us, the same electricity that had been there from the moment he'd arrived. It was undeniable, and now that we'd acknowledged it, impossible to ignore. He shifted closer, his knee pressing more firmly against mine as he leaned forward. "What are we doing?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense anyway. All I knew was that there was something between us, something I couldn't explain, but didn't want to lose. I searched his face, looking for a sign that he felt the same confusion, the same pull. When our eyes met, I knew he did. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart racing, "but I don't want it to stop." His eyes darkened, and for a second, I thought he might pull back, might suggest we leave things as they were. But instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my hand. The touch was soft, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through me. I found myself leaning into him, closing the small gap between us. "I don't either," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Before I could speak, his hand cupped the back of my neck, pulling me closer until our lips met again. This kiss was different, less hesitant, more certain, like we'd both made a decision. and there was no turning back. The heat between us flared, intense and consuming, and I lost myself in the moment, in the feeling of his hands on my skin, his lips on mine. We stumbled back onto the couch, our bodies pressed close together as the kiss deepened. My heart raced, and I couldn't get enough of him, the taste of him, the feel of his body against mine. Every touch sent a thrill through me, and I knew I was completely and utterly hooked. Luke's hands roamed over my back, pulling me closer, his lips moving down to my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I tangled my fingers in his hair, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he kissed a trail along my jawline. The intensity was overwhelming, but I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want him to stop. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, Luke pulled back, breathing heavily, staring down at me. His eyes were filled with a mix of desire and hesitation. I could see the struggle playing out on his face. He wanted this as much as I did, but something was holding him back. "Wait," he whispered, his voice rough. "We need to slow down." I blinked, my mind still reeling. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, his hand still resting on my shoulders. "Because I don't want this to just be a one-time thing." His words hit me hard. I'd been so caught up in the heat of the moment that I hadn't considered what might come after. But now that he'd said it, I realized I didn't want it to be a one-time thing either. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Luke's eyes softened, and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead before pulling back slightly. "Then let's not rush. Let's take our time." I nodded, my heart pounding. He was right. We didn't need to rush this. Whatever was developing between us was too important, too real to hurry through without thinking. I didn't want to ruin it by moving too fast. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath as the intensity subsided. But even though we'd pulled back, the connection between us still burned, and I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation and stolen glances. We talked about everything and nothing, laughing at small things, sharing stories about our lives. It was easy, natural, like we'd known each other longer than a few encounters. But beneath the surface, the tension still simmered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. When Luke finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment. I didn't want him to go, didn't want the night to end. But I knew we were taking things slow, building something more than just a fleeting moment. He lingered by the door, his hand resting on the handle as he turned back to me. "I'll see you again soon, right?" I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Definitely." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Good. I'll call you." With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving me standing in the quiet of my apartment, my heart still racing. I leaned against the door, my mind spinning as I replayed the events of the evening. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was the way we'd connected on a deeper level, the way we'd both acknowledged that this wasn't just a one-time thing. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, like maybe, just maybe, I'd found something real, something worth holding on to. But the story didn't end there. The best part was yet to come. The following days were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. I couldn't stop thinking about Luke, about everything that had happened, about what might happen next. He'd said he would call, and though I knew it hadn't been long, I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for his name to appear. When the call finally came, it was late afternoon, just as the golden light of the setting sun filled my apartment. I glanced at the screen, my heart leaping when I saw his name, and quickly answered. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my pulse had quickened at the sound of his voice. "Hey," he replied, his voice low and warm. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab a drink tonight. Nothing fancy, just, to hang out." I smiled, feeling a wave of warmth. "Yeah, I'd like that." "Great," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. "I'll pick you up around 7. "Perfect." I hung up the phone, my heart racing with excitement and nerves. I knew tonight wasn't just about drinks. It was about figuring out what was happening between us, about taking the next step. But despite the uncertainty, I felt a sense of calm. I wanted to see where this would lead, wanted to explore the connection we had. By 7, I was more than ready. I'd spent most of the afternoon trying to focus on anything but the anticipation building inside me. But now that the moment had arrived, I felt strangely at ease. When Luke knocked on the door, I opened it to find him standing there, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, looking effortlessly handsome. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Yeah," I replied, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. We headed to a small, cozy bar not far from my apartment, the kind of place that wasn't too crowded but had enough atmosphere to feel alive. We found a booth in the corner, away from the noise, and ordered drinks. As the evening unfolded, it became clear that the tension between us was still present, but it had transformed into something different, something more comfortable, less urgent. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me stories about his work, about growing up in the city, and I shared my own stories, how I'd ended up in this apartment, the small challenges of life that we all face. It was easy, natural, like we'd known each other much longer than we actually had. But as the evening wore on, the conversation shifted, and the weight of what had happened between us began to creep back in. "So," Luke said, taking a sip of his drink before setting it down, his gaze steady on mine. "We haven't really talked about the other night." I felt my heart skip a beat, but I nodded. "Yeah, we haven't." "I'm not trying to rush things," he continued, his voice soft but serious. I've been thinking about it a lot. About us." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. There was a pause, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the intensity of his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. This was it, the moment where we decided what came next. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken that night in my apartment. I think there's something here, something worth exploring." His words hung in the air, and I felt a surge of emotion. I'd been thinking the same thing, that whatever was happening between us was too important, too real to just walk away from. Hearing him say it aloud made it feel more concrete, more possible. "I agree," I said, my voice steady but soft. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing either." Luke's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The simple touch sent a thrill through me, and I couldn't help but smile. "So, what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. "I guess we take it one step at a time." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. We didn't have to have all the answers right now. We didn't have to know exactly where this was going. All we had to do was take it one day at a time, figure things out as we went along. We spent the rest of the night talking and laughing, the tension between us easing into something more comfortable, more certain. And when the bar finally started to close, we walked back to my place, the cool night air wrapping around us as we strolled through the quiet streets. When we reached my door, Luke hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the door. "I should probably go," he said, though there was a hint of reluctance in his voice. I bit my lip, not wanting the night to end just yet. "You don't have to." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. But then he smiled, his hand slipping into mine as he stepped closer. "Okay," he whispered. We headed inside, the quiet of the apartment enveloping us as I closed the door. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of the night hanging between us. But then Luke reached out, pulling me close, and I felt the warmth of his body against mine, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. The kiss came naturally, soft and slow at first, but quickly deepening, the familiar heat building between us once again. It was just like before, intense, consuming. But this time there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just about the physical connection anymore. It was about the bond we were forming, the trust and understanding that had grown between us. We stumbled toward the couch, our bodies pressed together as the kiss deepened. My hands roamed over his back, feeling the firm muscles beneath his shirt, and a thrill of excitement rushed through me. But this time, there was no urgency, no rush to get lost in the heat of the moment. We were taking our time, savoring every touch, every kiss. Luke's hand slid under my shirt, his fingers warm against my skin, and I shivered at the sensation. His touch was gentle, careful, like he was afraid of pushing too far, too fast. But I didn't want him to hold back. I wanted him to know that this was okay, that I was ready for whatever came next. I pulled away from the kiss just long enough to look into his eyes, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I want this." Luke's eyes darkened, and he nodded, his hands tightening on my waist as he pulled me closer. "Me too," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. We went on for hours, and as true love arises, that happened right there.